This is it. The moment I've been waiting for, even if you haven't. This week you are going to write your suspense story, and today I'm going to read you mine. It's a day later than originally planned, but I hope you're going to like it. Now, this is the only video we are releasing today, other than the live maths lesson. And the reason for that is because it's probably going to be quite a long one. It's going to be at least 2 lessons worth. Obviously, I've only just started recording it, so I'm not sure exactly how long it's going to be, but I want this to be the focus of your day. If all you get done today is writing the first part of your story, mission accomplished. That's what I want. I want you to take your time on it. I want you to focus on it. This is your aim. So, we're in for a long video. I'm going to pause at different points. I'm going to say to you, right, go and have a break, come back to me in a little while, and then you can go off and have some lunch or whatever. But for now, I suggest you get yourself a nice drink, maybe a snack, because I've got one. Settle down and be ready for our lesson to begin. Okay, so we are going to be writing your story. But first, I'm going to read you mine. I released the front cover yesterday on Seesaw. My story is called Reflection in the Water, and it's by me. It's entirely written by me. Might have the odd mistake in it, not sure. It took me all weekend. The reason it took me all weekend is because you shouldn't ever write a story in one go. If you write it in one go, it starts off really high quality and it just gets worse as you go through because you get tired and you get bored and your enthusiasm goes. So I knew I had to do it in chunks. So I did the first bit, left it a while, went back, did the next bit. And that's what you're going to be doing with your story. I'll talk about it more in a minute, but you're not going to write the whole thing today. If you write the whole thing in one go, it won't be as good as if you split it up. I promise you. I've done it myself. Okay? Take your time. We're going to split it into chunks. You're going to write a bit today, write a bit tomorrow, etc., etc. Reflection in the Water. I'm not going to tell you too much about it, really. I'm just going to sort of read it to you. There's the front cover. Chapter 1. Demolition. It was during the morning rush for school that Callum first saw the newspaper article. He was always the last one up in the morning and seemed to fall out of bed like a stone hitting water. Pulling on his blazer, he threw a tie over his neck and pulled it up tight. One thing he'd learnt since starting secondary school was the incredible ability teachers had to spot a badly worn tie from a mile away. Not that getting in trouble was anything unusual for Callum. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Luckily, his best friend Nick was well enough behaved for the both of them. As he grabbed some toast from the kitchen table, Callum spotted the newspaper article. Wobury Primary School to be demolished on the 17th of February. He snapped his head back to read the article more closely. His old primary school had been closed the year he left, apparently due to numerous issues with maintenance and water pipes. The school had been the regular victim of flooding, and it got to the point where it was costing too much for the school to remain viable. Callum supposed he shouldn't have been surprised the school was going to be demolished. After all, it was just sitting there empty. However, it still filled him with a sadness to think that he would not set foot in it again. With a slight sigh, Callum grabbed his bag and headed to the door. He checked his watch. I'm going to be late again to meet Nick, he thought to himself. Nick was waiting for him, as he did dutifully every morning, at the end of Callum's street. Even from a few feet away, Callum could see that Nick was still struggling to find a blazer small enough for him. It was always something they joked about, as Callum had the opposite problem. This difference in height often made Callum and Nick seem like an odd friendship. Indeed, there wasn't much, on the surface, that seemed to link the two boys at all. Nick was small, with a slight frame, well behaved, and generally quite shy. Callum was, well, he was not any of those things. One day I'm just going to leave, Nick called as Callum approached. But then, who would protect you from those nasty Year 7s who are taller than you? Callum teased. Nick shot a look at Callum and was clearly about to say something, but thought better of it. They started to walk towards school. "Been up to much over the weekend?" Callum asked Nick, trying to gauge how annoyed he was at his previous comment. Nick didn't even take a breath as he launched into his story. Clearly, he wasn't that upset. "Well, I was meant to go swimming at the weekend to try and get better at it, but it was cancelled again. Something about the pipes that feed the pool playing up." Nick had been trying to learn to swim for several years now. He went to lessons once a week, and even watched YouTube videos at home, although Callum wasn't entirely sure how you could learn to swim in your bedroom. Despite all this practice, Nick was still about as much use in water as a boat with a hole in it. "At least you're willing to go in the pool. Better than me," Callum said. It had been 5 years since he nearly drowned in a swimming pool while on holiday. Ever since, he had been petrified of pools, and even the sound of the sea could set him off. That was one thing the boys definitely did have in common: a fear of water. Nick tried to speed up, but he was clearly afraid that they were going to be late. "Did you see about Wobury?" Nick asked, marching slightly further ahead of Callum despite his considerably shorter legs. "Yeah, saw it this morning. Suppose it was always going to happen. Just seems strange. We only left a few years ago." Callum took 2 steps and was already back in line with Nick. "I kind of wanted to see it one last time," Nick said. "I was thinking of walking home that way after school today. Did you want to come? We can just stand outside for a minute and say goodbye." "Say goodbye? Should we hold a funeral as well? Get it some flowers?" Callum laughed back. He may have laughed, but deep down he thought it was actually a good idea. "Shut up. Fine, I'll go by myself," Nick spat back, speeding up again. "Nah, I'll come with you. Without me, you wouldn't be able to see over the hedge." Nick shot that look at Callum again, and they marched off to school. Chapter 2. A Slight Detour. Callum met Nick after school by the bike shed. It'd been a long day, and Nick's enthusiasm for visiting Wobury seemed to have diminished. "Maybe we should just leave it. I'm not that fussed anymore," he said, dawdling behind Callum. "Come on, it'll only take a little while. We might not get another chance." Callum had been thinking about visiting all day, and the idea had grown on him. He was even prepared to drop the act of saying it was stupid if it meant they could go. "I thought you weren't that fussed," Nick said, knowing full well he was toying with Callum. Callum let a wry smile cross his face. He was actually quite impressed that Nick was trying to catch him out. Normally, he wouldn't have bothered. "Well, it's pretty much on the way home. Besides, I know you really want to go." "Up to you, though," Callum said, trying to remain cool. Nick wasn't buying it. "Mm-hmm. Yep, if you say so." The walk to Wobury only took 10 minutes, but the increasing deluge of water falling from the sky made it seem like hours. The sky, which had been blue only hours ago, was now the colour of a muddy puddle. Puddles were forming in the potholes on the road. Callum hadn't realised how quickly the area surrounding Wobury had become so derelict. The road was covered in cracks, and litter was strewn across the pavement. On the far side of the street sat a single car, which looked like it had been there since Callum's mum went to school. The school itself was set just back from the street, with a playground separating the main building from the outside world. The building looked much the same as Callum could remember, albeit considerably more run down. Windows were boarded up, and the previously bright paintwork was flaked and fading fast. The pipes, which snaked along the sides of the building, were about the only things that seemed to have survived the last few years untouched. The grass of the school field looked as if it would come up to Callum's waist, which was no small feat considering his height. Whilst most of what Callum could see was familiar, albeit in a state of decay, the large security fence was not. The fence surrounded the school like a grey cloud, barbed wire protruding from the top. Warning signs stood to attention at various points along the fence, slightly hunched over as if feeling the weight of their responsibility. The warning signs seemed odd to Callum. Surely the site wasn't that dangerous. Signs he had seen in the past normally said no trespassing, or private land. The signs here simply read, Danger. Right, we've seen it now and I'm soaked. Can we go? Nick asked, his hair plastered against his forehead with the weight of the rain. Callum was soaked too, but he wasn't ready to leave just yet. You can go if you want. I want to have a walk along a bit. He hoped he would be able to see into the school a bit more clearly. His act of being too cool to visit here, was fading fast now, and he wasn't quite ready to let go of his old primary school just yet. 5 more minutes, and then I'm leaving, Nick replied. The ease at which Nick gave in to staying longer suggested maybe he was feeling the same way as Callum. Of course, neither of the boys would actually admit to it. Apologies, I'm going to have a quick drink. I said we're in this for a long time. Yes, you probably heard that. They walked slightly further along the fence, trying to find a better view of the school building. No matter how far they seemed to walk, the fence and tall grass seemed determined to ruin their attempt. Just as they were about to give up, Callum spotted something different in the fence up ahead. Is that? Callum thought aloud. Yes, and no, we're not doing that, Nick replied, clearly knowing Callum's intentions before he did. Just up ahead, the uniform grey steel of the fence ended, broken by a large hole just slightly smaller than the boys. As soon as he saw it, any desire to go home had suddenly disappeared for Callum. Nick, however, was seemingly less keen. Nope, I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no, he spat, turning around as if to leave. Oh, come on! 5 minutes, we can be in and out again. No one will know, Callum replied, trying to sell it. He was going in there regardless, but it would be better if Nick came along as well. Just as Nick was about to reply, the rain, which was already beating down on them, picked up pace significantly. As if the sky had opened, the water lashed down on top of them. It was so bad that Callum was struggling to get his words out. Every time he opened his mouth, water would rush in, and he felt like he was drowning. Callum, with his aversion to water on full show, was spluttering in front of him. Need to get to cover. Nick nodded, or rather shook his head vigorously and pounded across the cracked playground towards the main building. The overhang that once covered the waiting area was in as good a condition as the rest of the school. Whereas once it might have provided shelter from this sudden storm, now it was peppered with holes and proved no resistance to the weather. The word storm was becoming more appropriate by the second to describe what the boys were now facing. The rain, still lashing down with the force of an ocean, was now joined by a loud rumble and the occasional spike of lightning in the near distance. The rumbles were seemingly getting louder, and the lightning seemed to be dancing around them, as if creating a barrier between the school and the outside world. The boys turned, frantically searching for some way into the building. All thoughts of going home had now vanished. It would be too far in this weather. They were better off waiting the storm out and then leaving when it was dry again. Callum scanned the building, looking for a door or window not entirely covered by cladding. It appeared whoever had secured the site ready for demolition had been very thorough. Every possible entry point was covered in numerous layers of cladding, and every door secured with multiple chains and locks. It seemed a bit much to Callum, but maybe that's what happens to all abandoned buildings. Over here, Nick called, his voice muffled by the sound of water. He was waving towards Callum while pointing at what used to be the back door to the school kitchen. As Callum rushed over, he could see what Nick must have seen. The chain on this door was loose, and there didn't appear to be a padlock on it. The thunder rumbled closer now, deafening the boys, and a bright flash of light sparkled behind them. With frantic effort, they pulled the chain free from the door, opened it, and bolted into the darkness within. If it looked like I suddenly changed, that's because I paused to sneeze. Chapter 3. Shelter. Water seemed to be dripping from everywhere, as Callum tried to take in the room in front of him. The muffled sound of rain hitting the roof was the only noise in an otherwise eerie silence. The space was dark, with slithers of dim light trickling in from holes in the cladding that covered the windows. Kitchen equipment lay strewn across the floor, covered in a rust that seemed far too prominent for the relatively short time the school had been closed. As was the case with the outside of the school, The inside looked like it had been abandoned for decades. "Should have just gone home," Nick muttered, pacing slowly to try and keep the cold from his sodden clothes from getting to him. Callum did, he supposed, feel slightly guilty for persuading Nick to come, but at least, he thought, the rain had given him an excuse to actually look inside. He had wanted to look around inside from the moment they saw the school from the outside, but he couldn't work out how on earth he was going to persuade Nick to go in. The rain and the storm removed that issue quite nicely. "Well, there's no point going outside again until the storm passes, and we should probably keep moving so we don't get too cold," Callum said, trying to keep up with Nick's pacing. "So first, we take part in a bit of breaking and entering, and now you want to go on a guided tour?" Clearly, the cold had dampened Nick's usually oh-so-chipper spirit. "You can stay in here if you like. I'm going for a wander," Callum replied, ignoring Nick's comment and setting off before he could pitch in again. Callum half expected Nick to stay put. After all, the normal limit of Nick's rule-breaking was underlining his work without a ruler. However, Callum was also fairly sure that Nick's fear of being alone in a dark school kitchen would outweigh his moral sense of right and wrong. Sure enough, as Callum exited the kitchen into the school dining room, he could hear Nick's quick footsteps as he tried to keep up. "As soon as the rain stops, we're leaving," Nick said, clearly trying to justify what he was doing to himself. "Exactly," Callum replied, moving through overturned tables and chairs. The state of the dining room was much the same as everything else they'd seen so far. Their memories of a warm and inviting space to eat could not be further from what it now was in front of them. Water poured in from the cracks in the roof, and the puddles formed wherever the floor wasn't perfectly even. Leaping over as many of these puddles as they could, the boys left the dining room and emerged into the main corridor. Wobury's layout was shaped like a capital I, with one main corridor spanning the distance between the two separate classroom areas at either end. Along the main corridor, where the boys now stood, were the toilets, office spaces, and communal areas, such as the dining room. The younger school classrooms were off to the left of the boys, and the older classrooms off to the right. "Where should we go first?" Callum asked, eager to explore as much as he could before the rain stopped and Nick abandoned him. "Wherever. I really don't care as long as it's dry." Nick's enthusiasm for this trip down memory lane really had completely vanished. Unperturbed, Callum pushed on, deciding they would head towards the upper school classrooms first. He figured they would hold the strongest memories, and might even bring a smile to Nick's face. The same face which currently seemed to be resembling the mood of the weather outside. "Let's see if our old classroom is in any better state than the rest of this place," Callum called behind him to Nick, trying to broach the rapidly intensifying awkward silence. Nick simply nodded in reply. They walked along the corridor, trying to avoid the water pouring in from odd holes in the ceiling. Where these holes were, the dim light of the outside world trickled in, casting shadows onto the walls. The walls, previously covered in bright pieces of artwork, now looked more like a home for graffiti artists. Damp lingered in the air, and Callum's nostrils flared at the occasional smell of rotting flesh that he could only imagine came from a dead animal somewhere amongst the rubbish. As they approached the upper school classrooms, a glint of metal caught Callum's eye. Off to one side, a water fountain was bolted to the wall. In itself, that wasn't particularly unusual. In fact, Callum could remember using it many times whilst trying to get out of lessons. What was odd was the fact it looked brand new, gleaming as if it had just been installed. This was, of course, in stark contrast to almost everything else in the building. Just as he was about to approach the fountain, Nick pushed through the door into the upper school. "Come on, this was your idea in the first place, let's get it done with," he shot, the venom in his voice clearly aimed at Callum. At least, Callum thought, Nick was talking to him. The boys entered their old Year 6 classroom and were dismayed to find it in the same state as everything else. Wandering over to the teacher's desk, Nick called out behind him. Mr. Roderick would have had a heart attack at this. Mr. Roderick, their Year 6 teacher, had always been keen on a tidy classroom. Not that he would actually do the cleaning, that was always the job of the class. "Yeah, but he would turn it into a great story, though," Callum called back, moving over to the book corner area. Mr. Roderick was known for his love of telling stories. It was one of the main reasons the boys loved having him as a teacher. He had a love for books, and always made sure his class knew about it. Do you remember the story of the girl in the lake? Nick asked, rummaging through Mr. Roderick's old desk. Clearly he was enjoying this a little bit more than he was letting on. The one where she drowned, Callum replied, wandering over to the sink. Yeah, that's the one. I didn't go to the bathroom for a week after that, Nick said, a slight smile on his face at the memory. The story Nick was referring to was one of the best Mr. Roderick had ever told. A story, he said, based entirely on fact, even though no one believed him. Well, apparently no one, except for Nick. Mr. Roderick had told the story so many times Callum could almost recite it, word for word. Chapter 4. The Medicine Woman. Mr. Roderick told how Wobury was built on a dried lake, one that had been deep and had been at the centre of the town. Hundreds of years ago, it had been the source of the town's drinking water, where cattle were brought to drink and where clothes were brought to be washed. The town, which would later become the one the boys now lived in, had been set up purely because of the lake being there. In the early 17th century, word of the town's prosperity reached outsiders, and the population began to grow. Those from smaller villages in the surrounding areas moved to the town and brought with them new knowledge and experiences. By the mid-17th century, the town's population was into the hundreds, a considerable size for the time. Life was good, and the townspeople were content. All of that changed in the summer of 1665, when a mysterious illness began to claim lives. No one knew where it had come from, and no cure seemed to work against it. Whilst initially it seemed to be contained to the traders from London, it soon spread to the general population. All who fell ill with it died in agony mere days later. The people prayed and hoped, but nothing seemed to be able to stop the devastation the disease caused. Families were decimated, and the town was on the brink of collapse. Then one day, as if out of nowhere, a woman arrived into the town, claiming to have knowledge of medicine. With the town's original medicine man dead, the woman was initially welcomed with open arms. No one believed she could do anything, but at least someone was there to hopefully ease the suffering of those dying. However, easing suffering was not going to be an issue for the woman. The day she arrived, the dying stopped. People from the town still became ill, but each one, without fail, recovered after visiting the new medicine woman. Within a month, the town was recovering, and illness rates had fallen dramatically. Many claimed she had saved them. Initially, the medicine woman was hailed as a divine being, a miracle that had been granted to the town people by God. However, no sooner had the word divine mentioned than whisperings began about magic. The word witch soon buzzed about the town, and any gratitude towards the woman vanished, much like the disease had. Word had come in from other towns of witches and the dangers they posed. On the morning of 17th of February 1666, the medicine woman was tried for crimes of witchery. She was sentenced to an ordeal by water, due to be carried out immediately. Should she drown, she would be found innocent. Should she survive, she would be found guilty and then burned at the stake. No more than an hour later, the medicine woman was strapped to the dunking stool and lowered into the lake. As she sank beneath the water, she did not speak a word. She simply tapped her leg 3 times. Mr. Roderick then told of how the lake dried up less than a year later. Without a source of water, the town disbanded and its residents moved to other places. It was only hundreds of years later that people resettled in the area after the bombings of the Second World War. It became known as a new town, and Wobury was built soon afterwards on the site of the lake to serve as the town's first school. He would then go on to say that in the weeks leading up to the death of the medicine woman, her spirit would rise and take revenge on the town which had treated her so brutally. Anywhere water was present could provide the opportunity for her to return to the living world. It was at this point Mr. Roderick motioned to the sink in the classroom and the bathrooms in the corridor. Safe to say it was this that had caused Nick not to visit there for a week. At the time, Callum found the story amazing. He remembered being sat there in awe as Mr. Roderick told it. You could hear a pin drop in the classroom as everyone sat, feeling somewhere in between terrified and exhilarated. Callum didn't believe for 1 second that it was based on real life, but he loved the story all the same. Chapter 5. Making Amends. Back in the classroom, the sound of the rain could still clearly be heard on the roof above. Mercifully, however, this seemed to be the only room in the school with no holes in it. Callum and Nick had pulled up 2 chairs and were currently sat huddled in the book corner. The dampness of their clothes was beginning to take effect, and Nick had begun sniffling. "How you feeling?" Callum asked, not really sure what to say. It was a bit of a silly question, but at least it filled the silent void. Nick didn't even have the energy to give his normal level of sarcastic response. "Not great. I feel like I have a river in my nose and I can't really feel my fingers." Now that he mentioned it, the temperature in the room did seem to have dropped. The grey of the sky outside made it difficult to tell the time, and his phone had died a while ago. All Callum knew was that whilst the temperature may have changed, the weather outside had not. "Have you got a tissue?" Callum asked Nick, pathetically. In truth, he was feeling guilty now. If he hadn't persisted with coming here, they would have been at home right now, shouting at each other over the internet while playing games. Instead, they were sat in a derelict classroom, in the middle of a thunderstorm, with only each other and the dripping tap in the corner to keep them company. "Oh, I think they're in my other coat," replied Nick, referring to the tissues. "You want me to see if I can get you some?" Callum asked, desperate to be helpful. The guilt was getting to him, and he felt like he needed to do something. Leaving wasn't an option yet on the account of the weather, but he could at least try and make it a bit easier for Nick while they were stuck here. "Where from?" The energy really had gone from Nick. He was now sniffling more quickly, and seemed to be trembling where he'd sat from the cold. I'll go and check the bathrooms. They might still have something in them. If not, I'll see if I can get into the cleaner's cupboard or something." Callum was already on his feet, feeling relief that he had an idea that might actually help. "If you're sure, just be quick, alright?" Being alone in an abandoned school is typical horror movie stuff. Nick seemed to drift off as he said the words. His eyes dropped slightly, and his breathing shallowed. Callum would probably be gone and be back before Nick even realised. Chapter 6. Noises in the Night. The corridor was still quiet when Callum left the classroom. He had been careful to close the door carefully, as it seemed like Nick had managed to drift off to sleep. Part of Callum wondered if it was a good idea leaving him to sleep, but at least Nick wouldn't realise he was alone that way. The light from the outside was definitely fading now, and the early winter night time was quickly approaching. It was only when he was halfway along the corridor that Callum noticed something different to earlier. He could not hear the rain. Water still came in from the hole in the roof, but whereas before you could hear it pounding on the roof, now there was only silence. The silence was accompanied by a deathly chill, and Callum could see his breath as it escaped his lips. His footsteps echoed as he moved forwards, trying to remember where the bathrooms would be in the half-light. Drip. Callum paused. The sound of a single drop of water caught his attention. Had the sound of the rain pounding on the roof still been there, he probably wouldn't notice the single drop. However, in the now deafening silence, every sound was clear to him. Drip. The sound was rhythmic, clearly from a tap not fully tightened. In a way he was grateful for the noise, as it meant he must be near the bathroom. Drip. Drip. It was slightly quicker now. Callum put that down to him getting close to the source. He moved forwards, sweat suddenly lining his brow. He wasn't sure why, but he was suddenly feeling hot. Callum kept walking. Just off to the left, he could make out the water fountain he had noticed earlier. It was covered in rust. Callum turned to take a closer look, but as he did, a sound caught his attention from further down the corridor. It was the unmistakable sound of a running tap. His heartbeat quickened, but he was convinced it was nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. It had been a long day and he was tired. He was probably slightly delirious. However, as he continued to walk along the dank corridor, The sound of running water became undeniable. It was coming from the same place as the dripping he had heard only moments before. Perhaps it was all of the rain outside that caused the tap to burst, Callum reasoned to himself. Now creeping, he crossed a small distance to the door, leading to the bathroom. The sound of running water could still clearly be heard. With a sharp breath, he pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. Chapter 7. Reflections in the Water. A smell of damp and decay hit Callum's nostrils as he entered the bathroom. He choked slightly at the stench of it. As he had grown to expect from the rest of the school, the bathroom looked like it had been abandoned for a few decades rather than a few years. The small windows that separated the far wall from the ceiling were boarded up, with the odd hole letting tendrils of light in. From where he stood, Callum could make out sinks lining the walls to his left and right, each with a mirror above. Up against the far wall were the cubicles, each with the door either hanging off or missing entirely. The first sink immediately to his left seemed to be the source of the running tap. He moved towards it and twisted it, first to the left and then to the right. No matter how hard he twisted, it would not budge. He looked up and caught his reflection in the mirror. His eyes looked bloodshot and his skin looked very pale. Drip. Behind him another tap dripped. He snapped around. The sink immediately in front of Callum released a small drop of water every few seconds. Drip. Drip. To his left, yet another one. Drip. 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 This one in the far corner on the opposite wall. His heart hammered in his chest. This was beyond his ability to reason now. He turned, about to bolt from the room, until he heard it. Tap. 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 3 of them, like a knocking against wood. Callum retreated backwards, not looking where he was going. His mind was on the door, but panic was taking over. His legs hit the sink, and his hands grabbed on for support. His eyes darted around, but it was as if darkness had suddenly thrown a curtain over the room. Tap. 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 From behind him, the mirror above the sink. He turned slowly, nearly fainting at what he saw. The mirror above the sink did not just show Callum. To his left was a figure, a woman with water pouring from her mouth. Her clothes looked old and she had ropes tied around her wrists. She didn't move, other than to tap her leg. Tap. 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 He could not move. Tap. 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 She reached out a hand and placed it on his shoulder. Tap. Chapter 8. Nick. Nick's eyes blinked open. As he came around, he struggled at first to remember where he was or what he'd fallen asleep. Then the sight of the derelict classroom brought him back to reality, and he remembered everything. He wished he was still asleep. Stretching his arms, Nick stood up and paced over to the sink. He vaguely remembered Callum saying he was going to get tissues, so guessed that's where he'd gone. The tap of the sink dripped, but all else was quiet. Even the rain outside seemed to be easing. He could make out a shadow approaching the door from the corridor. Nick turned to the book corner, making sure he hadn't left anything behind. The shadow drew closer and seemed to pause outside the door. "Come on, Callum. Let's go. The rain's clearing." The shadow seemed to reach out a hand towards the door. "You don't need to knock, Callum. I'm not that mad at you." The shadow reached the frosted glass of the door and tapped 3 times. Tap. 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 And that is the end of the story. Okay. That was Reflection in the Water, an original story by me. I hope you liked it. I really enjoyed writing it. Please do let me know on Seesaw if you did enjoy it. I enjoyed reading it anyway. What I'm going to suggest you do now is go and pause the video, You sat through the first half an hour, go and have a break, go and run about a bit, or do some drawing, or watch a YouTube video or something, and then come back and we'll do the first part of the English lesson. Okay, see you in a minute. Okay, you're back, I'm back, having drunk my hot chocolate, and we will carry on with the lesson. So we've just read the story. We're now going to start writing. So let me put this into PowerPoint mode. Okay. So today, by the end of today, you will have written the introduction for your suspense narrative. This is where you will introduce the characters. To be successful in this lesson, you need to use show not tell description to describe your character, and use speech to show the relationship between your two characters. Remember, I did say you need to have two characters because there needs to be a conversation between them and you need to build that relationship. Okay, pause. We are only writing the introduction today, so do not rush ahead. As I said earlier, a good story is written in several sittings. You don't sit there and write it all at once. I know how tempting it is. Believe me, I wanted to get it finished. But also believe me when I say it won't be as good. So pause. Also remember to stick to the genre. It's very easy when you're writing a suspense story to drift off into horror or action or fantasy or zombies and all of that sort of thing. You're writing a suspense story. The whole point of a suspense story is it could be real. If it's to have an effect on your reader that you want it to, i.e. you want them to be on the edge of their seat, they need to believe that it is at least possible. It needs to be based loosely on reality, which is why I set mine in a school, because it's something you can relate to. The thing about the mysterious illness, that is actually real. If you look it up, it was the 1665 plague of London. And I mentioned that it came in from travellers and traders from London. Based on reality, twisted for suspense. How do we want it written? Now, this is the end result of 3 weeks of work. So obviously, it's been a lot of effort from you guys. You've put a lot into this. You've read a lot of stories, you've planned, you've now going to write it. So we want to see it. And really, we want you to bring it in to school whenever we return, whenever that might be. So that means, for most of you, we want it handwritten, please. Like you would if you were in school. I'm not insisting on it. I'm asking for if you could. And then you can bring it into school. You can take a photograph on Seesaw to show it to us every day, but bring the final story into school, because we want to put it in your English books. If you decide to type it, it's okay. I get it. Some of you type in school, so of course you're going to. And some of you might prefer to type. Again, that's absolutely fine. But we either need you to be able to print it or to email it to one of us so that we can print it for you. Because again, we do want to see this story. The good news is we can use this story as part of our evidence when we look at all of your writing across the year, and we can say, yep, you've done a great job, and then we pass that on. Okay? So, an important piece of writing, do your best at it. Please bring it in when we're back to school. Okay, so we're writing an introduction. An introduction sets the tone for your story, i.e., it's the thing that either makes your reader want to carry on reading or puts them off completely. Now, for a suspense story, it should include a very subtle hint towards the main point of the plot. So in my story, I mention water a lot. I drop it in there, pardon the pun. If you notice on the newspaper article, Wobury was due to be demolished on the 17th of February. You later find out that the ghost of the medicine woman reappears in the week leading up to that time. Coincidence? No. Planned deliberately? Yes. And that's what you're going to do. You're going to sort of drop hints that at the time make no sense at all, but later on become important. In the beginning, the fact that the school was shut down due to water pipe issues, seems perfectly normal. Later on, not so much. The features that you're going to need to include are show not tell and speech to convey your character. Okay, so if we have a look at the example of the Curse of Cogston House, which was the first story we read a couple of weeks ago now, let's see what we can find. What features can we find? So, if we have a look over here, it starts by introducing a character. Straight away, first sentence, character. We know their name. So we've got character, it's got strode. So they're doing a bit of show not tell here. Didn't just walk, he strode. That shows me he's got confidence. Relishing a mission. Again, he wants to do it. Through the jungle, dodging the occasional stinging nettle with an effortless skip or jump. So, first paragraph describes the character. Really well. Really good job. Next paragraph here. Come on, Luca, this is going to be epic. So, more character description, and he starts to talk to his friend, so that we're getting an idea of their relationship, how they get on with each other, what their personalities are. Luca dawdled behind. We're introducing the second character now. As we've spoken about before, they've used the word dawdled. They've not, which suggests he's nervous. They've not said he's nervous, but we know it because they've used show not tell. Then it tells a bit of backstory. Pardon me, hot chocolate's getting to me. Then a bit more conversation between the characters. It shows the relationship. Speed up, we're nearly there. What does that tell us about the relationship? Well, it tells us that Jack's in charge. Luca wasn't at all sure that they should be leaving the park swings. This tells us a bit more about the character. So, what does Curse of Cogston House do in its introduction? It tells us about the character. They talk, which gives us an idea about their relationship. It builds a foundation. Without that foundation, the story is weak. You need to know who your characters are, and you need to know how they link together. And you need to make the reader kind of care about your characters, because if the reader doesn't care about your characters, they're not going to care later on when something happens to them. Okay, so example 2 from my story, Reflection in the Water. Let's see how this is structured. It was during the morning rush for school that Callum first saw the newspaper article, so introduce the character. He was always the last one up in the morning and seemed to fall out of bed like a stone hitting water. We've got show not tell to describe him. What does that tell us about him? Well, if he's always the last one up in the morning and seemed to fall out of bed like a stone hitting water, that suggests he's quite lazy. Pulling on his blazer, he threw a tie over his neck and pulled it up tight. Again, he threw it over his neck. He's not that bothered. Lazy. One thing he's learnt since starting secondary school. So, we know he's in secondary school. That tells us his age. Has it actually told us his age? No. But we know what age he is around because we know he's in secondary school. With his incredible ability, teachers had to spot badly worn tie from a mile away. If he's caught wearing a badly worn tie, what does that suggest about him? That suggests he'd get into trouble. What does that suggest about him? Well, that suggests he's a bit of a rule breaker. We find that out later. Not that getting into trouble was anything unusual for Callum. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Luckily, his best friend Nick was well enough behaved for the both of them. So, we've just mentioned the second character. So, the first paragraph of my story, all it does is introduces and describes character 1. The main character. So out of your 2 characters, whoever the main one is. What do we move on to? We've got a bit of backstory going on. Bit more show not tell, all about character 1. And it just mentions some of the hints about what's going to happen later. So we've got a few hints going on here. Hints about the plot. Okay. So, what's your introduction going to look like? Now, I'm going to show you a structure of an introduction, and the reason I'm doing this is because it's, as I said, really important you don't rush too far ahead. Okay, so the way that we would like you to structure introduction is you start with introducing the characters, and you use show not tell to tell us about them. That's the first thing you do. Then you make a reference to the main point of your plot, like I did in mine. You start to drop some hints. Now, to be able to do that, you need to know what's going to happen, which you need to go back to your planning sheet from last week to find out. I did the planning sheet. That's how I knew what was coming later on. I didn't just start writing. The characters meet up. Their speech gives us clues about their relationship. So you're going to have the next paragraph where they get together and they talk. The things they talk about will give us clues about how they get on with each other. Then we set off towards the main setting of the story. Now they're going towards the setting. They're not there yet. That's really important. The first part only deals with the journey to the setting, not actually at the setting. So if originally you thought to yourself, I'm going to start by describing the setting, whoa, pause. Get your characters first, get your setting later. Show not tell and speech is used to make the reader realise one of them is anxious. That's really important. Give us a hint that one of your characters is a bit afraid. It makes it more believable later on when they're scared, which they're going to end up being. Okay, so using show not tell. What is show not tell? Well, show not tell is a great way to describe a character. It makes the text a lot more interesting. It's where we are told something by what a character does or says, rather than just the author telling us. So, if we were being boring, we could just say Henry was tall. Does the job. Not very interesting. If we're using show not tell, we would say ducking slightly as he entered the room, Henry approached the kitchen table. If he has to duck, he's tall. I know he's tall. I've got that picture in my head. I don't need to say it. Much better, much more powerful. This is what we're aiming for. Not all the time, though. Sometimes we just need to say it. For example, in mine, I just said he was a bit of a troublemaker. Later on, I say that, he's got Nick is small with a slight frame, i.e. quite thin. I just said it. You're not going to use show not tell in every single sentence. But the important thing is you use it some of the time. If you want a number, aim to use it at least 3 times in your introduction. Not this. Absolutely not this. Henry was tall for his age, with brown fluffy hair. He was 12. He walked into the room and saw a newspaper article on the table. It said something about strange noises coming from an abandoned factory. Henry was excited by the sound of this. He loved mysterious things and was excited to tell Jess about it when he got to school. It's very boring. I don't need any imagination to read this. A good book should leave the reader with the chance to paint pictures in their head, not just be told everything. It's very like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then I fell asleep, and then everything ended. Blah, 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 blah. You get the point. Instead, try this. Now what we need to do is have a look at each of these, pause the video and see what each of these tells us about the character. So pause the video now, work out what they tell us. Off you go. And you're back with me. Okay, so we're going to have a little pause after this before we move on. Right, let's have a look at the first one. Head back to read the article more closely. His old primary school had been closed the year he left. Well, if it's his old primary school, that means he's older than 11. Have I been told that? No. Do I need to? Also no. Callum grabbed his bag and headed to the door. He checked his watch. I'm going to be late again to meet Nick, he thought to himself. What does that tell us? It tells us he's not very organised. Does it say that? No. Do we know it anyway? Yes. It was during the morning rush for school that Callum first saw the newspaper article. He was always the last one up in the morning and seemed to fall out of bed like a stone hitting water. This tells us he's a bit lazy and, again, not very organised. Nick was small with a slight frame, well behaved and generally quite shy. So this is what I was saying about. We're not going to use show not tell all the time. This is me just saying he is this, he is this, he is this. However, Callum was, well, he was not any of those things. That's telling me he's literally opposite. So it tells me he's tall, quite well built, not very well behaved, and quite confident. Have I said those things? No. Did I need to? No, because I've just said it's the opposite of Nick. Okay, pause video now, go have a 5-minute break, come back, and we're going to write the first part. Okay, and you're back, and I'm back. So, you're going to start writing now. You're going to write the first paragraph, the first part of your paragraph, where you introduce your main character. Just that part. You're only introducing your main character. You might mention the other character, but then they haven't met yet. They've not talked yet. That's coming in a minute. For now, they meet. Sorry, ignore that. For now, introduce your main character. Hint at the plot that's coming later. If you're not sure of, you need some ideas, go back to my story. Rewind. Listen to my introduction. Copy bits of it. Not all of it, it's mine. But you can take bits of it, I don't mind. If you need some sentence starters, because that's always tricky, pause on this slide. I've given you some sentence starters here. Feel free to steal them. I don't mind. I've left a gap for your character's name. What must you do? This first part of the paragraph must have show not tell in it. At least 3 times. Your character needs to do something. Maybe getting ready in the morning, or walking to wherever it is they're going, or whatever it might be. Don't just do a character description. Henry was tall, he had this, no. Have your character doing something, and as they do it, drop bits of description in. Reveal the basic details, but more importantly, we don't care if they have brown hair, we don't care if they're, wearing a white hoodie. What we care about is their personality. We care about a personality, not their hair. So give us a sense of that. I leave the sentence starters up. Now I would suggest you give yourself 25 minutes to do this, probably. Don't rush it. You're just writing the first part of your paragraph. Off you go. Come back to me when you're done. And you're back, having written the first part of your paragraph. Lovely. Have you had a break yet? If not, go and have a break. Part 2 coming up. Remember, this is your only lesson for today, so don't worry. Everything else, don't worry. We're not doing anything else today, just this. It's a long video, just this. I've been sat here now for nearly an hour. You've been sat here for nearly an hour. I can't remember what I'm meant to be saying. Let's carry on. Part 2. You've written the first part of your paragraph. You've introduced your character. Now your character's going to meet the other character. And they're going to talk. Because they're sociable. So, they're going to meet. They're going to have a bit of a conversation. They might be and they're going to be walking towards wherever your setting is going to be. You can tell us if they're friends. But you need to show us that they are friends by how they talk to each other. I hope you saw from Nick and Callum in my story that their relationship had quite a lot of banter in it. They liked to tease each other. I didn't tell you that. I showed you it by the jokes that they made. So if we have a look here, which is better? Well, the one on the left, if we have a look, Henry and Jess had been friends for as long as he could remember. They would always play together online and made fun of each other whenever they could. They trusted each other and knew it was only a friendly joke. One day I'm just going to leave, Nick called as Callum approached. But then who would protect you from those nasty Year 7s who were taller than you? Callum teased. Nick shot a look at Callum and was clearly about to say something, but thought better of it. They started to walk towards school. Did you want to come? We can just stand outside for a minute and say goodbye. Say goodbye? Should we hold a funeral as well? Get it some flowers? I bet you can see the one on the right's better. You can tell that they like to have banter with each other. You can tell they're sarcastic towards each other. But I haven't needed to actually tell you it. I've shown you it by what they say. You may be thinking, but how am I going to do that? How am I going to show the relationship between my characters? Well, luckily, it's step by step. The first thing you need to decide is what the relationship between your characters is going to be. Are they friendly? Is one more confident than the other? Are they a bit sarcastic towards each other? You need to decide. Do they sort of not really like each other? You need to decide what their relationship is first. When you've done that, you need to think of a conversation that they could have which would show you that. So, here's an example. One is a lot more confident than the other. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to do a conversation that shows us it. The conversation they could have is they talk about playing online and one of them spent all game in the corner hiding. The effect is the reader realises that one of the characters is scared quite easily. The conversation allows us to realise that. They have known each other for a long time. You're not going to say that. You could, however, have a conversation between them where they talk about a memory from years ago. The effect's the same. If they had that memory together from years ago, they must have known each other for a long time. They're really close and are both a bit sarcastic. How can I achieve that? Have one of them tease the other. But make sure the other one doesn't get too upset about it. Otherwise, that's not the relationship you want them to have. So you need to decide now what relationship you want your characters to have and what conversation they're going to have to achieve that. Pause the video now. Think about it. Okay. Just quick recap, rules of speech. So the spoken word and any punctuation marks go inside the speech marks. The first word that is said has a capital letter, always. A comma separates what is said from who is saying it. So what happens in this bit? Well, this is the final part of your introduction, the final part you're going to write today. Your characters need to meet up. They have a conversation that tells us about their relationship and reveals their personalities. They're going to walk or travel towards the setting of your story and tell the reader why they are going there through their conversation. In my story, they decided to go and visit the school to say goodbye to it. Don't describe the setting yet. Your characters are not there. That will come tomorrow. Save it. Don't rush this story. A good suspense story is slow. If it's too quick, it doesn't have the same effect. Build it up slowly. And then when it gets to the final part, pick up the speed. Make it dramatic. Okay, so, your turn. Final activity today. I've kept this pretty much at the hour mark. You're going to write the rest of your introduction. Make sure you do not go too far ahead. You must include conversation between the characters. I expect to see conversation. Your characters are going to travel to the setting or make a choice to go to the setting later on. By the end of the introduction, the reader must know why your characters are going to the setting. It can't just be random. Hand breathe. Thank you so much for listening. This has been an hour-long video, which kind of makes up for the fact it's meant to be 2 lessons worth. Please take your time with your introductions. Don't rush them, and do not rush ahead as much as you might want to. Remember, we do want to see this brought in whenever we may return to school, so type it up, write it out in handwriting, however you're going to do it, keep it safe. Lovely to hear from you. Let me know what you think of my story on Seesaw. For now, in Spanish, because I know that now, adios.